All right, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books and St. Louis Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts, the VLAA. Welcome CEO of PEN America, Suzanne Nossel, who will discuss her new book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, in conversation with former St. Louis VLAA Board President and Thompson Coburn partner, Mark Sableman, and current St. Louis VLAA Board member and word artist, Pacia Elaine Anderson. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We celebrated 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Suzanne, Mark, Pacia, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore, and especially the volunteer lawyers and accountants for the arts who gave us this great idea to do this event. So thank you so much for helping make this happen. We have adapted to the current situation and are still bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books. We are offering curbside pickup, delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. And we have appointments available in the evenings. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We have produced nearly 100 virtual events. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. That is part of our event programming. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or all of your friends at left-bank.com. And purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. So thank you for your support. We need your support. I'm Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so you can type those questions as a comment at any point throughout the conversation, and we will get to those at the end. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books, the Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts, and PEN America on Facebook to be notified about all of the fantastic virtual events that these organizations are producing. About Dare to Speak. A vital, necessary playbook for navigating and defending free speech today by the CEO of PEN America, Dare to Speak provides a pathway for promoting free expression while also cultivating a more inclusive public culture. Online trolls and fascist group chats, controversies over campus lectures, cancel culture versus censorship. The daily hazards and debates surrounding free speech dominate headlines and fuel social media storms. In an era where one tweet can launch or end your career, and where free speech is often invoked as a principle but rarely understood, learning to maneuver the fast-changing, treacherous landscape of public discourse has never been more urgent. In Dare to Speak, Suzanne Nossel, a leading voice in support of free expression, delivers a vital, necessary guide to maintaining democratic debate that is open, freewheeling, but at the same time respectful of the rich diversity of backgrounds and opinions in a changing country. Centered on practical principles, Nossel's primer equips readers with the tools needed to speak one's mind in today's diverse, digitized, and highly divided society without resorting to curbs on free expression. At a time when free speech is often pitted against other progressive axioms, namely diversity and equality, Dare to Speak presents a clear-eyed argument that the drive to create a more inclusive society need not and must not compromise robust protections for free speech. Nossel provides concrete guidance on how to reconcile these two sets of core values within universities, on social media, and in daily life. She advises readers how to use language conscientiously without self-censoring ideas, defend the rights to express unpopular views, and protest without silencing speech. Nossel warns against the increasingly fashionable embrace of expanded government and corporate controls over speech, warning that such strictures can reinforce the marginalization of lesser heard voices. She argues that creating an open market of ideas demands aggressive steps to remedy exclusion and ensure equal participation. Replete with insightful arguments, colorful examples, and salient advice, Dare to Speak brings much needed clarity and guidance to this pressing and often misunderstood debate. Margaret Atwood says, a must read, and Salman Rushdie says, in our censorious age of easy outrage, when it's harder than ever to defend our right to express conscientious ideas. Suzanne Nossel remains convinced that bigotry and intolerance can be fought without giving way on the principle of free speech, and makes her case eloquently and even better, usefully. An authoritative, essential book. Suzanne Nossel is the CEO of PEN America, the foremost organization working to protect and advance human rights, free expression, and literature. She has also served as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA, and held senior State Department positions in the Clinton and Obama administrations. A government of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, Nossel frequently writes op-eds for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications, as well as a regular column for Foreign Policy magazine. She lives in New York City. Tonight, Suzanne will be in conversation with Mark Sableman and Pacia Elaine Anderson. Mark Sableman practices media and First Amendment law as a partner at Thompson Coburn. A longtime St. Louis volunteer lawyers and accountants for the arts volunteer, he took the lead in the organization's efforts to support the free speech rights of David Polfus, the young St. Louis artist whose painting was removed from the US Capitol. He served on VLAA's board and is a former board president. He also taught censorship and free expression at Washington University School of Law. And Pacia Elaine Anderson is a written, spoken, visual, and teaching word artist. In 2020, Pacia became the St. Louis Visionary Artists' first Community Impact Artist honoree. She collaborates as a teaching artist, creative consultant, and community development and engagement strategist with numerous organizations and institutions, both locally and nationally. Pacia is a St. Louis Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts board member. And now, I'm certain you are all waiting patiently for me to get done. I am so happy and very proud to be able to welcome Suzanne Nossel, Mark Sableman, and Pacia Elaine Anderson for Left Bank Books and the Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts. If everyone at home would please help me in giving them a giant round of applause. Hello, everyone.
Greetings.
Well, thanks so much, Shane, for the introduction. And thank you on behalf of St. Louis Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts for letting us be part of this conversation. We're especially happy to be the ones to introduce Suzanne's book to the St. Louis community. It's a great book, and as you'll see from our questions, there's a lot to learn from it. Suzanne, could you begin by just telling us a little bit about what PEN America does, since that's obviously part of the background of your experience and what went into the book?
Sure. So our mission at PEN America is to both celebrate and defend freedom of expression worldwide. And when it comes to celebration, we do that at an intimate scale with events centered on individual writers and books, and we do so at a large scale with big festivals and galas and public programs that engage the most fascinating, bracing writers of the day in conversation, in debate, in spoken word events, and all sorts of performances and panels. We bring writers from around the world for our annual PEN World Voices Festival, which is a dialogue between international writers and their counterparts in the US, founded actually by Salman Rushdie in the years after 9/11 out of a concern that the ties between American writers and their counterparts around the world were being strained and cut off. And all of those celebrations at PEN really are not just for their own sake, but in service of our work to defend free expression. And kind of the heart and soul of it historically has been work on behalf of individual writers who are silenced and imperiled for the crime of expressing their opinion. And so we do advocacy to get people out of jail, to save their lives, to protect them from persecution. And just this week, we had a victory with the case of Nasreen Sotoudeh, a writer and human rights lawyer in Iran, on whose behalf we've worked for many years. She's been jailed many times, but this time during the COVID pandemic, she was especially endangered. In fact, contracted COVID herself, undertook a hunger strike to protest the imprisonment of political prisoners, and was actually just over the weekend furloughed after a global campaign that we had waged. We also take on a whole range of free expression policy issues, including online harassment, press freedom, the crisis in local news across the country, with local news outlets being shuttered and shrunken because of the migration of ad dollars to online, as well as free speech on college campuses, which played a big role in informing my book. So I encourage everybody to take a look at the website at pen.org. You can become a member of PEN. We have professional membership for writers, editors, publishers, and journalists and others sort of working in this world, but also a general category of membership for anybody who wants to be an ally and support this cause.
I can see why there's so much great information that went into the book. You're dealing with individual cases, real people, real controversies. And it's kind of like what we do at Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts. We're in touch with real artists with real problems, and that really gives you a different perspective. But I think Pacia wants to walk you through some of the key passages from the book that help explain the book.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. A big St. Louis welcome to you. I really enjoyed the book. And for those who do not have it yet, you do have a passage on page 3, which I think sets a really wonderful tone for your approach and for the book itself. I think that if you could read a couple of those passages, I think it'll help people listening to understand the perspective. So on page 3, there's a really great paragraph, I think, that summarizes much of what we'll talk about today. And then also at the end of page 259, a really great bullet point on why we defend free speech.
Sure. I mean, just a word about the structure of the book. It's centered on 20 principles for how we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. And there are 5 principles that are directed toward you in your capacity as a speaker. So when you're using your own voice, 5 principles as a listener, 5 principles to follow when debating free speech questions, and 5 principles to consider when looking at free speech policy issues. So that's the basic structure of the book. And then this paragraph that Pacia mentions reads as follows. This book suggests guidelines that can protect ideas and opinions from suppression and also widen the circle of those who stand ready to defend free expression. My hope is to offer approaches and principles that can open conversation, tamp down conflict, unearth common ground, and avoid bans or punishments for speech. Rather than formulating mandates for government, technology platforms, universities, or other institutions, this book is focused mostly on the role and responsibility of individuals, all of us, as guardians of free speech. The book is intended for all those who seek to voice controversial viewpoints, hear them out from others, and keep their boardrooms, classrooms, dormitories, and dining tables open to fruitful conversations between people whose beliefs differ. And then at the end of the book, actually, the last chapter is devoted to essentially a reminder of why we protect free speech in the first place. Having talked all about what I think it's going to take to preserve and extend free speech into the 21st century, I end with this what I think of as kind of a clarion call to ensure that all of us keep in mind the reasons why free speech was enshrined in the Constitution as well as in international law. So I just summarize at the very end some of those reasons. Why do we defend free speech? Free speech enables society to uncover truth. Free speech promotes tolerance and lessens violence. Free speech is essential to individual autonomy, identity, and self-actualization. Protections for free speech foster economic prosperity, scientific progress, and creative achievement. And finally, safeguards for free speech have been essential to virtually every form of social progress attained by democracies.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And just before you talk about why we should defend free speech, you have a passage that really struck me. It says, we don't all have to be in complete agreement about why free speech must be defended, as long as these and other arguments in totality convince us that it must be defended. And I found that I actually appreciated that, because it offers an acknowledgement that we all come from different perspectives and recognizes that we all have different paths to the same goal. And it reflects, in my opinion, the understanding that the principles that you laid out in the book are supportive guidelines and not complete answers. This is how you solve the problem. That's one thing that I carried throughout the book, an appreciation for really the writing style, the concision, the ease of reading, the storytelling. Sometimes when we approach issues like free speech, we can get muddled down in case studies and legalese and personal opinions. And so for someone who may be approaching the book, considering this is a really heavy and weighty topic, I think you wrote it quite well for a broad range of people coming from different experiences. I found your approach really delightful.
Thank you so much. That's really nice to hear.
Yeah, and really along those lines, I thought that it must be one of the signs of clear thinking. You know, clear writing is a sign of clear thinking, because it was great how in those 20 chapter headings, you lay them out all as kind of clear rules, very concise, very, very clear. They're these great directives for people to act in a way that will promote free speech. Consider intent and context when reacting to speech. That's one of my favorites, since that happens so little these days. Call out with caution. Consider when to forgive speech-related transgressions. Those are chapter headings. And of course, the chapters, Spaciousness, fill it out beautifully with stories and great principles. So I think really you've written the right book for free speech today, today's free speech controversy, which isn't easy. And probably most important, you haven't taken an absolute position on either side, which is really unusual these days. You're weighing, you're looking at competing considerations, you're asking for sensitivity. But I guess that's amazing. We don't see it so often. How hard was it to kind of boil things down to these basic principles, and how easy do you think it'll be able to get people to follow them?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Look, I think for me, what helped the message of the book crystallize is really, an endless kind of array of conversations that I had through my work at Penn America, many of them through our work on college campuses. And, that work began sort of in 2015, when there were a series of incidents, including at Yale, a controversy about whether the university should be directing students as to which Halloween costumes they ought to wear and which costumes could be considered offensive, which became a huge controversy and blow up that I talk about in the book. An incident at Middlebury College where the theorist Charles Murray, associated with race-based theories that many people find deeply offensive, was invited to campus, and a kind of virtually a riot ensued, resulting in injury to a professor, and he was forced to give his talk from a closet where it was broadcast because students wouldn't allow it to go forward in the lecture hall as planned, and other incidents at the University of Missouri, University of California at Berkeley. And throughout all of that, in the aftermath, we started going around to some of these campuses and engaging in dialogue with students from across the political spectrum. It would be the college Republicans, the college socialists, athletes, people from fraternities, student activists, as well as faculty and administrators. And what really occurred to me listening to all of that was that there were merits on all sides of these arguments. There would be students who are calling for the campus to be a safe space and asking to be protected from ideas that made them feel uncomfortable or menaced. And the reflexive response of a free speech advocate to an argument like that is umbrage. They're sort of, what's wrong with these students? They need to develop a thicker skin. They aren't to be coddled. The whole purpose of college is to have a give and take and a fray and an open exchange of ideas. And, sort of what's awry with the rising generation that they're asking to be somehow shielded from this. But when we began these conversations, what I came to recognize was that was a misconstrual of what was going on, and that these students, for the most part, we spoke to were motivated by the drive to try to make their campuses and indeed our society as a whole more inclusive, more equal, to come to grips with the legacy of racism and other barriers of exclusion. And that yes, at times their demands and proposals crossed over into censorship, which from my perspective is a mistake. I don't think the right way to bring about a more equal and inclusive society is through the suppression of speech. But censorship was not their primary goal. Their primary goal was to overcome the stubborn legacy of racism and other forms of exclusion. And so the goal that, for me, what came to the foreground was the importance of explaining how it is that we can push toward this objective of a more inclusive, equal society without it coming at the expense of free speech. And so that really was my kind of opening principle or idea in setting out these principles. And I recognized that to make that case, you really had to think through, what it's going to take to present free speech in a way that will appeal to these ideals of people who are struggling for social justice, and how to explain that these causes that can sometimes seem to be at odds with one another can actually converge.
Well, I think in some ways your book is about human sensitivity more than it's about the law. I think that often, we lawyers, we write about absolutes, we write about legal doctrines, the overbreadth doctrine, the chilling effect doctrine, the Speech Act distinction, but free speech can't be solved by legal absolutes. It needs to be handled sensitively by people with ethical and moral points of view. And that's what I think your book really contributes that you don't see too often in a book on free speech. You're writing about sensitivity to others. Your chapter on no name calling. You're writing about the need to consider context, motivation, implications, the need for dialogue, the human fallibility factor, those sort of things. So it's almost a motivational book more than a legal book. But again, that strikes me as how difficult it's going to be to get that message across in today's atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that also occurred to me in my work at PEN America was that so many of the issues that we were dealing with, this includes issues of artistic freedom that I know both of you confront in your work when, there are protests and a museum is called upon to take down an exhibition because it's controversial, or if you're dealing with issues of online harassment or disinformation on an internet platform, or the deplatforming of a speaker at a private university. All those issues and free speech controversies really don't implicate the First Amendment. The First Amendment has little or nothing to say about those questions because they don't implicate state action. And the First Amendment, as we know, only constrains the government from infringing upon free speech. It doesn't speak about whether private institutions can do so, or internet companies, or even these cases of sort of speech versus speech, where an avalanche of trolls online has this kind of chilling and censorious impact on somebody who is venturing to voice a controversial opinion, whether it's about abortion or climate change or affirmative action, when they feel chased off the platform and driven to close out their account, because of the vitriol that has been heaped upon them. The First Amendment really is silent about that. And so, one thing occurred to me: for Americans, it's so natural to think about free speech and the First Amendment in one breath. And, you sort of bring up free speech and people immediately think, well, that's a question for lawyers and the courts. But increasingly, there are no answers there. And so that was part of my motivation writing this book, is the idea that actually as citizens, we want to sustain free speech into sort of the next rev of American society, a more diverse society, a digitized society, a society where we've become incredibly polarized. That's going to place demands on each of us. And we're actually going to have to get involved in how you defend free speech, how you ensure that whether it's, at the dining table or in the classroom or in the pages of a magazine, that there is space for divergent views to be voiced, that contrarian opinions can be heard, And so that was sort of part of the motivation for me in writing this book, was to, make that clarion call to individuals to get involved with this and to see that they too are going to need to play a role if we're going to keep speech free.
That kind of moves into what my questions center around, particularly being an artist and having lots of friends with very strong opinions who are artists. Before we get to the point of defense of speech, I'd like to talk about what you term linguistic conscientiousness, this idea of considering your audience, considering the range of people who might hear or read your speech and how it might impact them. Being an artist, part of the creative process is voice, is expressing who you are, and you put who you are into your work. How does linguistic conscientiousness square with that personhood of the artist, of them saying, this is who I am, this is how I express voice, particularly artists who have been silenced, artists who are marginalized, Black artists, artists of color, who are really documentarians of the times, who have taken it on as our responsibility. That criticism and that critique and that those different call outs come from people who aren't even in the intended audience. So how does an artist exercise linguistic conscientiousness without self-censoring?
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question. A couple thoughts. I mean, first of all, I think this idea of conscientiousness, that we don't just blurt out everything that comes to mind, is actually really ingrained in all of us, and that just as human beings, in the course of every day, I think we all have thousands of fleeting thoughts and ideas that we don't voice, for 100 different reasons, and that's part of living with other people. You just can't say everything that comes to mind, and so I think it's important to recognize that while I absolutely think self-censorship can go too far, I think there are some measures of voluntary restraint in the use of speech that are perfectly normal and appropriate. So it's not necessarily kind of just a categorical bad thing that we don't say everything that comes to mind. When I lay out the principle of conscientiousness, I kind of elaborated in a few ways. One is the presumption of heterogeneity in your audience, that when you're writing, there's some context, perhaps if you're writing an email to a small group of friends where you really know exactly who's going to read this and you trust them and it's not going to be passed along, and you feel relatively safe that the confines of how far your message is going to go are well known to you. But in most contexts, particularly today, that's not the case. If you post something on Twitter or on Facebook, or even, send out an email, it can be forwarded, it can be reposted, it can be excerpted, it could make its way, halfway around the world before you even know about it. It can be completely decontextualized. And so it's just that cognizance that, this is how information flows in the 21st century, and that as a speaker, it's something that you have to be mindful of and consider your words and how they might be interpreted if they are diverse from context. I also urge people, whereas decades ago, if you were going to publish, let's say, a letter to the editor or an op-ed, it would go through layers of pre-publication review by an editor, a copy editor, maybe it would be shown around the newsroom. Today, particularly on social media, none of those gating factors exist. And so we have to become our own editors. We have to think through sort of from the lens of somebody who has in mind, who's the audience for this? What might be on their minds? Is there any potential that this could be misconstrued? Are we going to offend someone? If we are going to offend someone, is that integral to the argument, or is that actually just an incidental thing, a poor choice of words that you could easily fix and thereby avoid a distracting tangent that detracts from the thrust of your message? I think you raised a very important question when it comes to artists? And, isn't there a danger that this sort of conscientiousness goes too far? And that's an issue that is being debated hotly right now, sort of in the literary world, in the world of writing, where, it can be white writers who are afraid of, crossing a line and talking about issues of race, and may sort of stay away from those questions entirely for fear of blundering and inadvertently offending someone. I think when it comes to artists of color, these questions that you bring up of sort of voice and people who in some instances may have felt constrained but now feel less constrained, are we really asking them to have to think through every possible audience when what may feel more important right now is just the opportunity that they have to express themselves and to be a force in society and to bring new issues to light that have been excluded from our discourse. And I think that's very valid. I think we have seen even just in the last 6 months a kind of opening up of new voices and attention turning to new voices and difficult questions being raised that previously, it's not like they weren't thought about, but they were, in various ways silenced. And to me, that's a boon for free speech. I devote a chapter in the book, as you know, to how to make the landscape for free speech more equal and deal with the barriers of exclusion that have kept some voices silent or at the margins. And, I believe if we go back to, what are the rationales for protecting free speech in the first place, and this idea of this very robust kind of crackling fray of opinions bumping up against one another, if there are certain groups that are excluded from that, whose voices aren't heard as part of that, who don't have, the education or the platform or the resources to be a part of that discussion, the value of the whole enterprise is impaired. That marketplace of ideas won't work as well. It's not going to be, it's not going to thrive to the same degree. And so, I think we have to absolutely recognize sort of the pluses for free speech of the entry of new groups, the amplification of new voices, and that, I don't want the principle of conscientiousness to be misunderstood as a mandate for political correctness or to avoid difficult ideas or even provocations. And I devote other chapters in the book to really talking about, how it is that you can discuss sensitive ideas and how to do so in a way that's going to be productive, where you minimize the risk of people becoming, fixated on a sense of offense or discomfort, and pushing past that so that people can engage in the substance of your ideas. I talk about the importance of defending those who articulate controversial positions, even if you don't agree with the positions themselves. And so there's sort of an interplay between these principles. And I think my hope is the combination, would allow for the breakthroughs of artistic expression that I think you're talking about.
Looks like we're narrowing down on the time we have left. I know Pacia and I have a whole lot of questions. Pacia, do you want to stick in one of those questions on calling out or cancel culture now, and then we'll try to wrap it up so we can get to the questions?
Sure. There's so much. So let's jump to cancel culture, because there's a part on page 92 where you talk about, I was going to read it, but for the interest of time. Oh, okay. On page 92, it says, even in the case of the worst offenders, we should not cede the power to cancelers to unilaterally dictate what movies can be seen, paintings viewed, or books read. The prospect of trying to expunge someone's influence from the culture based on misdeeds is futile and whiffs of the totalitarian impulse to rewrite the past. If individuals have fallen from grace, consumers should still be able to choose whether they want to listen to their music, read their books, or see their paintings. And I found that really interesting, because we do know that artists and creators are more than the things that they create, but it's hard to argue that the things that they create don't include parts of that person. And so it almost seems antithetical to say that we can cancel the person, but not the art. Can you speak to what that means for what cancel culture in general means for free speech, and why you argue that someone who has done something atrocious, their art may be, or that we rob people of the opportunity to choose if they still want to engage with that work by canceling them and the art itself. I hope I explained that clearly.
Yeah, no, you did. I mean, look, I think the term cancel culture, unfortunately, is sort of used rather elastically. It can refer to everybody from, a Harvey Weinstein and a Bill Cosby on one side, where we might all readily agree that, these are people that deserve to be stigmatized. They've been convicted of crimes, to, on the other side, someone like an Ian Baruma, who published a controversial article in the New York Review of Books and was then relieved of his post within a matter of days, or the editor of the New York Times op-ed page, when the same thing happened in the wake of publishing that op-ed by Tom Cotton over the summer about arguing for a militarized response to protests. And I think there are very big differences in these cases. I think, there's some instances, I talk about Roseanne Barr in the book, where I think, sort of the person falling from good graces and being ostracized is pretty justifiable on the basis of what they've done. And I think in other instances, and it goes back to the point, the whole chapter I devote to intent and context, where if you look at the intent and the context, you'll see it's more of a fleeting misjudgment, or something that's been misunderstood, and the person has expressed contrition, or at least an understanding of what the objections are. And I think cancellation in those instances can be a draconian penalty that not only is unfair to the individual, but that also sends a chilling message to everybody else, to all other op-ed editors. When a successor was named in the New York Times opinion page, sort of sent out a memo saying, everybody on staff, if you see anything that gives you the slightest whiff of discomfort, in anything that crosses your desk, let me know. And it's almost this sense of, having to be a little bit paranoid about any possible misstep you could make. And I think it makes it difficult to be an editor if the tripwire is that sensitive. Now, when it comes to the question of artistic works by people we have canceled, it's complicated. You of course have now, these reconsiderations in the art world of, historical figures like Picasso, interrogations of their personal lives and, discoveries of, misdeeds and indiscretions and things that by today's standards and, perhaps even by the standards of the day at some level, I don't really believe women were any happier being disrespected 100 years ago than they are today. But, people didn't speak out about it in the same way. The public discourse was very different. And yet do I think, we should stop exhibiting Picasso's work, or that people, we should decree that no one can study his work or go view his exhibition? I don't think so. I think that should be up to individual choice. And even with, Harvey Weinstein, his projects were not only his. He played a part in them, but so did many other actors, directors. Some of them are very much acclaimed. Some, a Shakespeare in Love. Like, do we decree that movie, should henceforth never be viewed on Netflix? I don't think so. I think, we should empower the citizen to take into account the full range of factors that they may want to in deciding what to engage in and what ideas to consider, and, whether a person's track record is grounds to reject all of their creative output or not.
Well, Suzanne, Shane has given us a slight, little few extra minutes. So let me go back to art censorship for a minute. And even though I praise you so much for being in the middle of the road and being reasonable, I'm going to kind of drag you away from the middle of the road for a moment and talk about some of the really bad art censorship issues we've had, because artists often are confrontational. They break boundaries. And if you tell an artist to be sensitive, it's kind of like telling Picasso or Kandinsky they have to paint Dutch masters. So we have real problems when when someone tries to censor art because it's controversial. And recently, we've had situations in our community where there's been kind of an effective art censorship I would call very much akin to a heckler's veto, where there are threats of violence or threats of confrontation, and events are then called off allegedly for the safety of everyone. But what that means is that the person making threats, the person saying we're going to cause a stir or we're going to imperil your safety, then has a veto power over that. And that's a really terrible thing. We're trying to work on policies so art institutions can better protect themselves from that. But I'd welcome any of your thoughts on that issue.
No, I really agree. And we've had a number of similar incidents that we've engaged with at Pen America. I mean, there was one at the Guggenheim Museum some years, a few years ago. They had an exhibit on China, and there was a vociferous protest by animal rights activists about a video in the exhibition that had pit bulls on treadmills. And the video actually had been made years before. And apparently the pit bulls weren't injured, but it was, maybe sort of cruel to put them in this position. But it wasn't created for this exhibition. It was something that already existed. And yet, nonetheless, that became the subject of just a thunderous protest. And it was exactly what you described, where the museum sort of on a Friday said, well, we're not going to give in, and no animals have been injured in the presentation of this exhibit. And by Monday, they had pulled, they didn't pull the exhibit as a whole, but they pulled several works, including that pit bull video, on grounds that, safety was endangered and that they had received threats. And, I think that sort of does become a kind of cover, in a sense, for the institution in some instances to, avoid just simply capitulating to the censoriousness of the mob and sort of having a different rationale for why it is that they are pulling a work. And I think we need to buck up our institutions, in a couple of different ways. I think in some of these instances, now there's this case of Philip Guston's exhibition, which was supposed to go up at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and 4 other museums, and deals with issues of race and has images, I think, has always been viewed as kind of path-breaking willingness to reckon with some of the, most terrifying strains of racism in this country, and to depict them and to interrogate them in a constructive way. And yet, I think the museums just basically feared any presentation with these themes and images, ran too much of a risk of being construed as racist, no matter the intent, no matter the context, no matter the interpretation that critics have had of these works over many years. And so they decided to delay the exhibition by 4 years just to kind of punt the issue into the future. And there are a lot of concerns. We voiced concerns, and many others in the art world did as well. So I think this is something we have to kind of come to grips with. And maybe there's sort of a structured process whereby there can be some engagement with stakeholders and perhaps some groups of stakeholders that have some influence over those that are speaking out the loudest in protest and exercising this kind of preemptive heckler's veto that you're talking about, to safeguard artistic expression and stand with museum leaders. Because I do, on the one hand, it seems so craven when they give in to protests. And yet, on the flip side, I do understand why it's really difficult. I mean, everybody who is an institutional leader these days is under enormous pressure, and I think kind of for good reason, to be responsive to stakeholders, and particularly stakeholders from groups that may have been marginalized or, deprived of access to decision-making and power in the past. And so, to just sort of wave that away and stand firm, I think it's really difficult. And to me, the answer is more engagement and engagement ahead of time. It's sort of once the protest begins, like the minute, it's like almost, the minute the first critical tweet comes out, if it's by, somebody with a loud enough megaphone, it can be almost impossible to kind of reel it back. And
that's the Hepburn Veto classic situation.
Yeah. I think we've got to sort of try to find ways of getting ahead of that, especially because in many of these instances, the curators sort of are aware that the work is edgy and that, there's going to be some discussion. So it's almost, maybe being far more affirmative in the contextualization and dialogue, in the lead up to even announcing a new show.
Hi, I'm back. So I think we will move on to the, this is an incredible conversation that I'm certain could go on for hours and hours, but I want to leave some time for the audience Q&A. So let's go ahead and start with the first question from Dan, but audience, if you're watching and you have a question for any of our participants, except for me, don't ask me, I don't know. So we'll start with Dan's question. How do Facebook and Twitter responses to outrageous false statements by certain persons, we'll just leave it at that, fit into the protection of free speech? And how does society respond to incendiary speech at the limit? And I know that this is an incredibly timely question with certain persons.
Yeah, so at PEP America, beginning in 2017, we did a report after the 2016 election, which was sort of the moment when fake news and disinformation, as it affects our politics, really burst out into the open. And we all learned that the Russian internet trolls had been posing as, Black organizers in Texas and inviting people to events and spreading messages and sowing division and working to discredit democracy. And, what was striking to us as a free expression organization is that overwhelmingly the speech that constitutes disinformation and misinformation is protected under the First Amendment. You're allowed to lie, you're allowed to use a pseudonym, you're allowed to engage in hyperbole, you're allowed to invite people to a picnic under any guise. And so, here's again another example of a free speech controversy where the First Amendment really has very little or nothing to say. And yet we nonetheless recognize that this posed a fundamental threat to free expression and open discourse. And it's because the right to free speech is not just the right to say anything that may come to your mind. It's the right to engage in this give and take, to persuade others and be persuaded, to be in a common quest for the truth, to be able to rebut falsehoods, and all of that in an environment that's flooded with disinformation. That value of free speech and the marketplace of ideas that we're talking about earlier, really becomes undercut and the market fails. And we've seen that in our country over the last few years with the truth, people losing sight of the truth, people becoming convinced to distrust credible news sources, losing the ability to distinguish between fact and fiction, having a president who's, and according to a Harvard study that came out about 6 weeks ago, is the #1 source of disinformation in our discourse. And when you look at the 2020 election, it's really not about foreign governments. It is inside the House. And so, I think we have to recognize that as a threat to not just free speech and open discourse, but to, also to the purposes for which we defend freedom of expression in the Constitution, and we have to combat it. And I think some of the steps that have been taken over the last few weeks, even with the social media companies becoming more aggressive and throttling back disinformation. And, they did it first back in the spring in relation to COVID, out of a recognition that quackery and false cures and just misstatements about the coronavirus were impairing pandemic response and endangering lives. And now, there's sort of a concomitant recognition of how it's undercutting our democracy and a similarly more aggressive approach to it. I think we have to be very careful because, we've always had a special place in our law for political speech. It's sort of the most sensitive type of speech, with respect to which the power of government to regulate, ban, and prohibit is most limited, because we recognize that openness of discourse is especially important when it comes to holding our leaders accountable or formulating policy. And so I'd like to see a lot more kind of fail-safes in the system. For example, I was just talking earlier with someone about a series of political posts that have been removed from Facebook. And when that happens to you, you really have no recourse. You can file an appeal online, but forget about getting a human being involved. And I think those appeals mechanisms and fail-safes need to become far more robust to match what I predict will be an increasingly aggressive approach to the policing of online speech.
Suzanne, isn't one of the answers to Dan's question that we have to distinguish between what is legally permissible and what is morally right? As you point out, the legal limits on free speech are pretty broad and include hyperbole and lies and anonymity and all those things. But that doesn't mean that's where we should be. We should be in a much more moderate place, because following all these principles in your book. In the same way, intermediaries like social media companies have absolute protection if they allow their users to say whatever they want to say. But they also have legal protection if they do content moderation and make sure that a more moderate, reasonable, useful corpus of information gets to the public. And so for so long, we lawyers have dominated the conversation. We talk about legal limits. But it's time for the ethicists to get involved and the social theorists, and we need to talk about what really works for society, not what is at the limits of the law.
No, I totally agree, and I think that's why, sort of in the book, I focus on these are principles that I wouldn't want these principles enacted into law. I don't want you to be legally required to be conscientious with language. I would shudder at the idea that government would be enforcing that. I think I basically agree with you. I think there are certain responsibilities that attend to citizenship in a diverse society that we should be undertaking voluntarily. And that's sort of the appeal that I'm making to people, is to consider, assuming these responsibilities out of their own free will. And I think one of the reasons to do it is that if enough of us are willing to take this approach, I actually think we'll all safeguard free speech, because we'll put some of the most nefarious side effects of free speech under greater control. And people will be more tolerant of this open fray if they feel like some of the most menacing forms of speech are on the wane, because people are actually exercising greater self-control.
All right. Let's, since I don't think we have any more questions, but I'm so wrapped up in this conversation that I'm like, tell me more.
We didn't get, let's go forward.
Before I get to that question, I did want to comment on self-control. You do say in your book that something about just basic common sense when we were talking about conscientiousness. And I often wonder how free speech is impacted when we're not in these anonymous places, right? When we're online, we tend to behave a little differently than we would if we were talking to people in person. And that's one thing that you can't regulate in any court of law, how to be a decent human being, right? So I just wanted to make that point, that we can get all of the people who are specialists in all the things, but no one can specialize in making you human. You have to do that yourself. I
totally agree. And about the kind of positive constraining effect of face-to-face communication. And I think one of the reasons we do see this surge in hate speech is because so much of our discourse has migrated online, and even whether it's anonymous technically or just anonymous enough because you're at a far remove from whomever you're talking to, and you're part of a fray of 10,000 people, and there's just there's no looking in the eye, there's no personal relationship. You're not going to see the person on the street or in the office or in the park the following day. And there's studies that demonstrate that in that context, a lot of the restraints that kind of govern human interaction just evaporate, and sort of it can bring out the worst in people. And so, I think with many of these controversies, the best way to resolve them is actually to put people together face to face, because they do tend to moderate, to have a greater ability to see things from a different perspective, to put themselves in the shoes of whoever it is that is on the other side of the argument. Of course, doing that has become even more fraught and difficult in our coronavirus age. I'm not sure even a face-to-face on Zoom has quite the same effect.
But if the possibility that can happen could cause some further self-restraint if they think I might have to talk to this person later. I don't know how we would make that happen. And I know we are up against time. One thing that I did want to make note of in your section on calling in and calling out, you gave some really great criteria for doing so. When it is appropriate to call someone out, when it is appropriate to call in, and how to do that. And I really appreciate that part, because we hear about calling in and calling out a lot, but no one ever really says how to do it, especially if you're not a people person.
No, yeah, I that was sort of why I included that, because there's kind of a lot of debate, about call outs, and some people think, this is awful, this is ruining our discourse, this is just pure nastiness, whereas other people say, no, this is, a form of exertion of power, and, these are essential voices that are finally able to speak their truth. And I think there's some merit on both sides. I think there are circumstances where call outs are warranted, where speech is public, where people have been hurt by it, where there are vulnerable people who may feel isolated, where there's a contestable opinion that if you don't confront it and contradict it, it's going to be left to stand. And there are people listening who may, walk away thinking, oh, that's perfectly acceptable, or, perhaps he's right about what he thinks about women. I think in those instances, it's really important to speak out publicly and forcefully. And even though there's an element of shaming, that's actually necessary and appropriate. And shame has its place in our civilization. It is, it's one of the constraining factors that helps us all sort of learn how to behave and how to adhere to social norms. That said, I think there are times when calling in is the right answer, where you think the offense may be inadvertent, where the person, wasn't willfully trying to upset others, where they may have an opportunity and the willingness to self-correct, then those are cases where if that shaming element can be avoided through a private approach, I think that's worth a try. So I sort of spell out, these different types of circumstances, and I hope will help people, learn, figure out what the right approach is depending on, what speech they're reacting to.
So Suzanne, it looks like we're down to our last minute. So let me give you one concluding question. We're here as an arts organization. And again, thank you so much, Left Bank Books. Thank you for letting us be part of the conversation. But what are your thoughts on the outlook for the arts, and what advice do you have for artists like Pacia and art leaders and art advocates like volunteer lawyers and accountants for the arts?
Yeah, look, I think we have to work together to kind of navigate this moment, which is going to, I think be one of important forward movement on diversifying the sector, bringing in new voices, dismantling barriers, forcing change in legacy institutions, but doing it in a way that doesn't run roughshod over free speech. I think that's a really important collective exercise. Because I think if it does run roughshod over free speech, it will also trigger a harsh backlash, and there'll be a sense that there's a kind of doctrinaire political correctness that's setting in the art world, and it's censorious, and there'll be resentments that are fostered. And I think there is a way to sort of square this circle, and that ultimately I think artists are natural champions of free speech. It is their lifeblood. It is what makes their work possible. And so I think sort of more dialogue and engagement with artists and institutions about how as I set out in the book, how these I think vital constitutionally enshrined principles of equality and inclusion on the one hand, and robust free speech protections on the other, how they can converge. I would hope that's a kind of rallying cry for for the years ahead in the art world.
I want to thank everyone, the volunteer lawyers and accountants for the arts here in St. Louis, VLAA.org, PEN America for making this event happen, PEN.org, and a reminder that books are available for sale at left-bank.com. I thought this was an incredibly insightful and just informative conversation. So I want to thank all three of you so much, Mark, Pacia, and Suzanne, for participating in this conversation, and for the audience watching. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Laura. It's great being with all of you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.